The other introduction is what Rabbi Blumenthal just mentioned. The Rambam says in Hilchos Tshuva, "Afal pi shehabechi yofe la'olam, yofe hi beyosev b'yomim shebein Rosh Hashanah v'Yom Kippurim." Even though tears and weeping are always good, they're better on the Yesodos Ha-emunah. So I'm not going to talk to you about the Yesodos Ha-emunah, but it's interesting the Rambam begins the statement. Even though tears are always good, what are they good for? What are tears good for? The teretz is tears, weeping, crying, creates what you might call a purgative experience, an elevating experience. It heightens your sensitivities. And I will tell you, I mean, you look at me standing before you today, don't exactly look like a pansy, right? Big burly guy. But I will tell you that I don't think I cried as a child as much as I cried on my first trip to Auschwitz and Birkenau. And I'm sharing that with you not with regret, but to tell you that if I cried, that you will cry. And as a result of that weeping, as a result of that grieving, what you will see, what you will experience, you will become exponentially greater than you are now. As great as you are. It will be one of the most unforgettable and rewarding experiences in your lives. And this is what I shared with Rabbi Blumenthal, and I think you're fortunate that he accepted my opinion on this, and he will be going to get such
Thank you. Thank you.
So, the Iker, and not because I'm the one that's sharing it, everyone has a sense of what he is saying being the Iker. That's a little bit of an egotistical twist that everybody has. I'm not saying this, therefore, because it's me that's saying this, but because, in terms of hashkafa, which is what most of you expressed an interest in hearing, what most of you expressed an interest in understanding, the limudim that come out of the Holocaust, the things, the messages that we take from it, convert into what we call Yesodos or Ikrei Ha-emunah, basic fundamentals of Jewish faith. These are the legacies that we take from the Holocaust, and therefore they have that tremendous importance. Like I mentioned earlier, the fuel for the fire, if you had not heard from Mrs. Zolti and Mrs. Bleeman earlier, if you had not heard from Rabbi Avram Bleeman and Rabbi Solitz Cohn, you would have been lacking even that inkling into a vast body of knowledge that you really should pursue. And I'm sure many of you have already pursued it. There are many books to read which are written al Taras HaKodesh. But the tachlis of learning all of the horrors is not to know the horrors, but rather to have them become transformed into these Yesodos Ha-emunah. Okay, so we've spoken a lot about learning the Yesodos Ha-emunah. Let's learn what, in my view, happens to be the primary Yesodos Ha-emunah that come from Holocaust studies. Incidentally, as I discovered last week, I think it was, from you, roughly 30-40% of you already have intentions of becoming mechanchos one day. I don't know what grade you'll end up teaching, but some of you might teach at a junior high or a high school level, and you might find yourself dealing with Holocaust studies from the teaching end, not from the learning end. So I feel that I have a little bit of a chelik, and even if not as teachers, as parents, you will have that. Mi'etz Hashem. I feel that I have a little bit of a chelik, and I'm very thankful to the Rebbeinu Shalom, a little bit chelik in forming the mindset on what will be the point of view about the Holocaust. Limud number one is like this. The Holocaust was born in Germany. Anti-Semitism was not born in Germany. Anti-Semitism was born in last week's Parsha. And it's been following us around in Golis throughout our Odyssey. The phrase anti-Semitism was born in 1884 and is used for the first time in Germany, in fact. But the Metzias, the concept of anti-Semitism, is ancient and also very current. But the Holocaust did erupt in Germany. To understand the impact that that could have on your lives, requires us to go back and to understand a little bit about Jewish exile in general. To understand the paradigm of Golus. Vosidiv Pshat Golus. We are a people well trained in Golus. I often say that we are a people that was born in Golus. And that was not by accident. HaKadosh Baruch Hu brought us there to become a nation. B'shivim nefesh yordo v'sechem mitzraymo. When we went down, we were a clan of 70 individuals. V'yato samach Hashem lekecho kechoichli hashamayim l'roiv. By the time Yetzias Mitzrayim happened, we had become a nation. We were born in Golus. Golus is in our fiber. Golus is in our collective mentality. But in order to make an impact, we have to understand the model of Golus. And in order to understand the model of Golus, we must take a look at Mitzrayim, at the events, and then we'll trace how that model that was laying in Mitzrayim followed us throughout the ages. You have to remember that when the Golus began in Mitzrayim, so to speak, it is when Yaakov Avinu, Yosef was sent ahead of time to prepare the Golus. It's the Heintige Parsha. But when the Golus began, when Yaakov Avinu came down to Mitzrayim, do you remember learning what sort of a reception Yaakov Avinu and the Shvatim received when they came to Mitzrayim? In modern lingo, this would be called the red carpet. Welcome to Egypt. B'mei Tach Ha'aretz Teishu. You should live in the best part of Eretz Yisrael, in the Nile Valley, the fertile area. He was considered royalty. He was revered. In fact, he was even revered as a deity, as some sort of a small g god, Yaakov Avinu. We think of Mitzrayim, we think of the Avdus of Mitzrayim. Avodim oyinu l'far b'Mitzrayim. You have to know that of the Redu Shonim, of the 210 years that Klal Yisrael were in Mitzrayim, it was only the last 130 approximately that Bnei Yisrael had become enslaved and suffered the bondage of Mitzrayim. The first 80, life was just grand. As I said, they were given a royal welcome and they lived and they prospered. They became a great and mighty people in Mitzrayim. They prospered. Life was just great. But sometimes, when the matzav around us seems so wonderful, we have to bear in mind that it might just be what is sometimes called the calm before the storm. There is a calm after the storm. There's also a calm before the storm. Just think to those grayish black days of summer when a tremendous storm is hanging in the clouds, in the air, and is about to descend. There's an eerie quiet prior to that. And then in all of its blasting fury, the storm comes and descends upon our heads. That is a pattern. But the pattern is not only meteorological, having to do with the weather and with rain, it has to do with the lives of Klal Yisrael. And take a look at the way it happened in Mitzrayim. Life in Jewish exile in Mitzrayim began wonderfully. And then all of a sudden, Paroi said, Havan ischak maloi, he got worried that we will overtake the land. V'nilcham banu v'yolim min ha'aretz. They'll force us out of the land, like Rashi learns. Slavery. The slavery that included ultimately the killing of male children. And included all of the things that you've heard from the time you were little girls, learning about the terrors of Jewish life in Mitzrayim. But there was that calm before the storm, and that is the pattern that I'm talking to you about. You see, later on, let's go much later, when the Yidden came to Spain. Let's talk about the year 711 of the Common Era. I know it's a store down the street, but it's also a year in the... Is it still existing, the store, 711?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I want to know if I'm outdating myself. The year 711 CE is when the Arabs crossed the Straits of Gibraltar and conquered the Iberian Peninsula, Spain. Along with the Arabs, along with the Muslims, the Jews came. And what begins from that year and lasts about 400 years is something we refer to as the Toir HaZahav, the golden era, the golden age of Spanish Jewry. Spanish Jewry flourished would be an understatement. They flourished not only financially, but also politically, but also religiously. You had such people like Chazdai ibn Shaprut, Rabbi Shmuel ibn Nagdela, Rabbi Shmuel HaNogid, who were prime ministers, right-hand men to the caliphs of Spain, but they were also Gedolei Yisrael, Rosh Yeshiva. Imagine a Rosh Yeshiva becoming the deputy prime minister of Canada. It's a preposterous thought, but that's what Jewish life was like in Spain. It was wonderful. Then all of a sudden in 1146 of the Common Era, a second wave of Arabs crossed the straits and take over Spain and Portugal. The Almohades is 1146. Life became a little bit more difficult, much more difficult for the Jews. It became difficult. It wasn't difficult prior to that. It became difficult. And then after that, the Christians came down, crossed the Pyrenees Mountains, and recaptured Spain for Christendom. And that made life even more difficult for the youth. The golden age of Spanish Jewry came to an abrupt and a frightening end. So what about those 400 years that life was just grand? The calm before the storm. We speak about Polish Jewry. Yidden arrived in Poland approximately 1,000 years ago, in significant numbers, and they started the community there. And for the first number of centuries, Jewish life had its challenges here and there, but for the most part, again, they flourished, they prospered, and religious life was always very heightened. Until 1648 and 49, the years that we refer to as Gzeiros Tach Votat, when Bogdan Khmelnytsky, Yamach Shmoy V'Zichroi, and his Cossack hordes came up from the Ukraine in order to reclaim the Ukraine from the Polish kings. But of course, if they're fighting against Poland, who gets in the way? Who always seems to get in the way? HaKadosh Baruch Hu's foot soldiers. That's us. 250,000 Yidden were butchered in a short period of time. Hundreds of communities, Jewish communities, were wiped off the map. But what about the life of the Jews in Poland? What about the hundreds of years of prosperity and relative calm? Well, it was the calm before the storm. Germany, the same. The land which is the birthplace of this so-called Jewish emancipation and Jewish enlightenment, and I use both of those words, was a sickening feeling in my stomach, because we've been neither truly emancipated and certainly not enlightened. For a Jew to be enlightened, it has to only be with Torah. But that's what we refer to it historically. The ghetto gates were opened. The university doors were opened. Jews became full and recognized members and equal members of a society in Germany in the early 19th century. And life, if that's called life, got better and better. Until after World War I. And the war, the seeds for the war were planted right after World War I. And then in the early 1920s, ultimately 1933, Hitler Yamach Shmoy V'Zichroi became the Chancellor of Germany. In September 1939, the war began. But that's not really the beginning. The beginning is from right after World War I. What happened to the century and a half of wonderful Jewish life in Germany? The calm before the storm. Now, what has this got to do with you? Now, far be it for me, Chalila B'chas, to plant the seeds of panic or fear. Certainly needless panic and needless fear. But on the other hand, if we are mature, we have to keep our minds open. We're living, Baruch Hashem, in societies which Gedolei Yisrael refer to as Malchiyos Shel Chesed, kingdoms of kindness, where we can practice our faith and flourish. We don't have to look behind us. most of the time, and worry if someone's going to take us to task for being Yidden. Malchus shel Chesed. By the way, we today don't know how to count our blessings, living in Canada, living in the United States, living in England. Our lives are very calm. By now, the repetition of the phrase should be ringing loud and clear. I'm not saying that this is the calm before a storm, because do I know, do we know, should we really fear a storm? Hopefully not. Hopefully the Geula will come quickly enough so that we will be spared yet another storm. But you should know that our lives presently, currently, when you get up in the morning, you look in the mirror, you see a person. That person occupies a certain space and a certain time. That time and space that you occupy is part of this calm. And it could be, although we hope certainly that it won't be, a calm before a storm. To understand Holocaust studies correctly is to understand that we are living in that kind of a trough in the events of the Jewish nation. Blessedly. But we should keep our minds open. Limud number 1. Limud number 2. Again, considering the source and the origin of the Holocaust. It was born in the nation of, or the country of, Germany. Actually, he, Yamach Shemoy, was from Austria, but he viewed Austria and Germany as one entity. It was born of the Germanic society and Germanic culture. Germany, in the 19th century and the early 20th century, was regarded internationally as the jewel in the crown of Western civilization. Nothing was more spitz, cultured, and sophisticated than Germany. The German philosophers, Hegel, Immanuel Kant, Wittgenstein, Nietzsche, Schopenhauer. I hope you don't even know these names. The musicians, Beethoven and Wagner and Mahler, etc., etc. And the poets and the writers, Heine, Schiller, and many more. Germany was it when it came to sophisticated Western culture. But you know what's interesting? Is that all of the culture and all of the sophistication of Germany was not able to save them from building crematoria and gas chambers in Auschwitz. All of the sophistication, all of the learning cannot convert a being who is without elokus, without divinity in himself. It cannot convert him into someone who is an elevated being. Because after all is said and done, they were the same as they always were. Which means all of that does not save us. Let me just share one example. The example is an event that I'm fond of quoting because it's so meaningful, so telling. The date was January the 20th, 1942. Let me give you just a bit of background. Right from the outset, when the Germans had conquered Poland, and it took them a Sach HaKoil of 1 month to conquer all of Poland, the Polish army collapsed like a deck of cards in front of this German onslaught, German military. So Poland was overrun by Germany in a matter of weeks. Right from the beginning, even during those original 4 weeks, the Hashmoda of Klal Yisrael commenced. Maybe you heard some. I think Rabbi S mentioned Chelmno, and what is called usually the death vans. There were two size death vans, 100 people and 120 people. Would be packed into the back of the van, and the exhaust of the engine would be filtered into the van through a pipe from the exhaust pipe into a hole at the top of the van. And after running the motor for about an hour, no one survived. Hundreds of thousands of Yidden were put to death that way. And then there was the ghettoization. One of you mentioned in your notes that I read how Jews conducted themselves in the ghetto. There wasn't a ghetto, there were many ghettos. Of course, the most famous is the Warsaw Ghetto. Mr. Cohn was in the Lodz Ghetto, which was the last one to be liquidated in Poland. Hundreds of thousands of Yidden died from famine, from starvation, from disease, typhus. About 450,000 Jews from the outlying areas of Warsaw were made to cram into an area which was suitable for about 40,000 people. In a room this size, it would be maybe 25, 30 people living with no food, or very little. So there was ghettoization, there was the death vans, there were Einsatzgruppen. Einsatzgruppen means the German soldiers would take Yidden and shoot them. They would be made to dig a big pit in the forest or in an open field and stand around and be shot into the pit. So they dug their own graves, so to speak. So there were many hundreds of thousands of Yidden being killed. But the Germans felt it's not going quickly enough. Just not doing the trick. We need a final solution. And if you've done any reading of the Holocaust, you might know that phrase, the final solution. The final solution meant an Eitzah to get rid of the Yidden more quickly. Somebody came up with an idea, and he wanted to share it with the upper echelons of the Nazi, of the Third Reich. So in a little palace in the town of Wannsee, which looks like it says Wannsee, it's pronounced Wannsee, outside of Berlin, beautiful palace, beautiful little quiet town, 15 officials from the upper echelons of the Third Reich assembled for a meeting where what was introduced was the idea of gas chambers. The Zyklon B gas, which was used, which was created by the G. Farben company, and it was used to exterminate insects. They figured this would be a good way to kill Jews. 15 people, a meeting that lasted under an hour, and the final solution was initiated, and the rest we know. From then and on until the end of the war, Yidden were killed in great numbers. Why do I mention this fact? Because of out of the 15 officers of the Third Reich, 9 of them at that meeting had doctorates. You know, you'd expect that people who attend that kind of a meeting, people who are coming in to offer a final solution to put human beings to death, are going to be the lowest of the low, the dregs of the earth. Hapchusim shebapchusim. 9 of them, of the 15, had doctorates, and the others didn't have doctorates, but they also had 1 or 2 degrees from institutions of higher learning. Where did all that higher learning get them? Where did these doctorates get them? They got them to Zyklon B, got them to Auschwitz, and to Majdanek, and to Treblinka, etc. The limud that we take from that is extremely important. Now, I'm not going to tell you that we should therefore remove ourselves from any study of culture or society or general studies, so to speak. How can I possibly tell you that? Number 1, I don't believe it. And number 2, I myself speak a reasonable English as well. That didn't come from eating Cheerios. But I am telling you that despite it all, I recognize, as we all need to, and as your future Talmidos need to, that all of the secular culture of the world will not elevate the human being. It saves him not from the worst possible deterioration of the human condition, if that's what's in the cards, so to speak. If that's what the direction is that they're going in, all of their learning will not save. What saves us from spiritual perdition? It's only our connection to the Torah HaKadoshah, only our connection to Maaseh Avos, our connection to the Hadrocha of Tzadikim, Das Torah. The rest is all fluff, and pretty empty fluff at that. The legacy that makes the only sense for us is our Yiddishkeit. That is an important limud. A limud from the Holocaust is that we are taught that secular culture is not an answer to anything. Even though at times it might be necessary, it's not the key to his alus or his roimemus hanefesh. Limud number 3. I mentioned from the parshiyos that we are reading these days what Chazal refer to as a halacha. Halacha hi biyadua Esav soina liyankov. Now, you people use the word halacha pretty commonly. This is a halacha, that is a halacha. Chazal didn't use the word halacha the same way that we do. When Chazal said the word halacha, generally it referred to a principle of reality or a rule that descended from Shemayim and that we don't necessarily understand. In fact, the Gemara sometimes interchangeably says halacha and halacha l'Moshe Nisim. A halacha is something that we cannot trace. If Chazal express themselves using the word halacha by saying halacha b'yadua Esav son liyankov, it's because sinas Esav liyankov is a halacha. It's something that you can't really reduce to specific principles. I know there's an organization called the ADL, a function of B'nai B'rith, the Anti-Defamation League, and they try to fight anti-Semitism, and truth of the matter is, all power to them. We don't need anti-Semitism. But to think that they can eradicate something which HaKadosh Baruch Hu infused into the Bria, no. There are people who hated the Jews in the course of years because we were too rich, too wealthy, too capitalistic. Then they turned around and they started hating us because we were at the heads of the communist philosophy, communist parties, where communism is an attack against capitalism. So, hello, go and make up your minds. Do you hate us because we're capitalists or communists? Some hated us because we enjoyed the protection of the barons and the magnates of Eastern and Central Europe. We enjoyed the protection of the kings and the counts. And others hated us because we were like a social pariah. We were outcasts. We were not part of society. Well, make up your mind. Why do you hate us? Books have been written trying to explain anti-Semitism. One was written by a French philosopher. His name was Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre, who gave a whole philosophical explanation for anti-Semitism. So he obviously attacked anti-Semitism. He had no tolerance for those who were anti-Semites. Well, see what happens is Sartre later in life got involved in a business deal with a Jewish fellow who took him for a ride. It happens, Because of that bungling of a business deal, guess who became an anti-Semite? Yes, the author of Anti-Semite and Jew, none other than Jean-Paul Sartre. The Reverend Rabbinim of Pshischa, whom I quoted earlier, said, this is why Chazal tell us that anti-Semitism, the Esav son liyankov, is a halacha. It cannot be reduced to specific sociological, demographical, or psycho-emotional principles. It's a metzius in the Bria. HaKadosh Baruch Hu placed it there. HaKadosh Baruch Hu placed Yankov and Esav in the same mokum. They emerged into the world together so that one would follow the other one throughout the course of history. So the Esav still hounds us. But that's okay. Because Yitzchak said, the HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, Rav Yavo Yitzoyer, we will continue to survive and to flourish. But when it comes to anti-Semitism, we should understand what it's all about. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is using it as a tool for our preservation. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. A related aspect, by the way, to that limud, it wasn't only the Germans that killed Yidden. Not only the Poles and the Ukrainians and the Hungarians and the Slovaks, but you know that thousands and thousands of our fellow Yidden could have been saved had they been warmly welcomed onto the shores of the United States, or Canada, Australia, other countries in the free and Western world. There was a famous memo that was written by a Canadian minister during the World War I, where the shaila came up: how many Jews should we accept, should we allow, what amount of Jews should we accept into Canada? How many Jewish immigrants should we allow into Canadian society? And the answer that he wrote, this particular minister: none. Not one. None is too many. I wouldn't say one what should get given, because obviously that would be ridiculous too. But none is too many. So the Esav Son of Yaakov, nobody had a monopoly on that. It's all around. Maybe think back to calm before the storm. If Chalim Rachas, something were to go a little bit awry with our lives, ... I won't finish the sentence. The fourth limud, and one which is perhaps one of the more painful ones to discuss, and that is Jewish disunity. If you'll do some Holocaust investigation, if you do some investigation, if you do investigation into Holocaust literature, you will find that there were two organizations that struggled desperately to save Jews, and they had some successes. They were the Vad Hatzolah of the Agudas Yisrael, and another organization also called the Vad Hatzolah, but it happened to be of a Zionist group of the right-wing Zionists, of the Irgun Tzvai Leumi, the Irgun. In fact, the two worked very often together, Bad Bevad, collecting money, making deals, trying to get Jews out of concentration camps, doing this, that, and the other. That's a whole shiur by itself. It's not for now. Other Jews, however, felt, no, we're not going to allow them to do that, because it's going to get in the way of other agendas, other dreams, other plans for the Jewish people. Let's forget about that. And they badmouthed these people who were working in Hatzalah. They stuck their foot in the door. No, that's the wrong expression. They undermined the efforts of people who worked for Hatzalah. There was Jewish disunity. People worked against other Yidden. I edited a book which is about 500 pages for someone who worked with the archives in Washington and in Eretz Yisrael, getting all the documentation showing how Yidden, Nebuch, were misled to have a yad in allowing other Jews to be killed. It's terrible to even talk about it, but you have to know that it happened. Books have been written about it. Perfidy and others. When you're in Beis Yaakov, the word achdus is always bandied about. Everyone's favorite word, make songs about achdus ahin, achdus aher. Achdus. Let me tell you what's at the root of the word achdus. It's the root of the word achdus, which is very commonly and unfortunately forgotten by most of the people who use Jewish unity as a slogan. The root of the word achdus is, what's the sharish of the word achdus? Echad. Who is the only one who lays claim to the title of Echad? The Rabbeinu Shalom. Where there is no Rabbeinu Shalom, there cannot be achdus. There's only me and you and him and her and he and she. The only thing that really does bind us together is the fact that we share this common Getlichkeit. We share this common Echad. We have the connection to the Rebbeinu. Where there is no Rebbeinu, there's no Echad, there's no Achdus. And that was proven When so many Jews in the Western world had the opportunity to help and to save Yidden, but they were misled by other agendas and had no connection to the Rabbeinu Shalom, the result was devastating. I know from my own extended family, which probably numbered in the area of 100 people, not one of whom survived except for my parents. Some of them might have survived. I know we're coming to Hanukkah, but Purim is similar to Hanukkah in many respects. Haman HaRasha, when he came to Achashverosh and he wanted to convince Achashverosh to kill the Yidden. Does any of you remember learning that when it says Vayomer Haman El HaMelech, that the Melech was not only Achashverosh, but it was actually the Melech Malchei Amlochim. Whatever Haman said to Achashverosh was intended for Hashem, the Melech Malchei Amlochim, to hear as well. Haman came to Achashverosh and it says Vayomer Haman El HaMelech Yeshnoi Am Echod Mefuzar Mefoyer Ben Ho'amim. There was a single people dispersed among the nations. So the Chassidish Sfarim tell us that what this is telling us is a Yesod. Yeshnoi Am Echod. Haman is saying to Hashem, there is this people that you've been protecting, God, but they are supposed to be thriving on the basis of Echod. However, look at them. Mefuzar Mefoyer Ben Ho'amim. They are dispersed and scattered. They are divided against themselves. They are disunited. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, you're right. And the Shemayim, they were maskim for the plot against the Jewish people. That's why the Yom Tov is called Purim, because not only was it a Pur down here, it was a Pur in Shemayim as well. Esther brought the Klal Yisrael to do tshuva. What was the thing that she told Mordechai to tell the Yidden of Shushan to do? That's the one that was born in Bergen-Belsen that I mentioned to you earlier. My sister. What did Esther tell the what did Esther tell Mordechai to tell the Yidden of Shushan? Leich? What? Again? Perfect. Leich knoises kol Yehudim v'tzumu alai shlosh yom laila v'yoyim. Leich knoises kol Yehudim. What's the importance of knois kol Yehudim? You know, Esther, why don't you just cut to the chase, get to the point. Leich, tell the Yidden tzumu alai. Tell the Yidden to do tshuva with 3 days of fasting. What's the pshat of Leich knoises kol Yehudim? What does knois mean? What does knois mean? To gather. Because Esther understood the problem with Klal Yisrael back then, as it is often today, as it was during the war, was this pirut, this disunity. So she understood if that's the makra, then the refuah has to be by undoing the disunity. Memela, she said, Leich noises kol Yehudim. As I said, it's a painful limud, one which I see that you're not really responding to, because I think you may be lacking some of the knowledge of what took place during the war. But if you were to read more of how Yidden got in the way of the efforts of other Yidden to help other Yidden, you would get the point with a greater impact. The fifth limud I'm going to leave until a little bit later if we have time for it, because it's very important, but I want to get to other things. And by the way, I can't help but just to point out that I came in earlier when Yisroel Cohen was speaking, and I felt the air, which was a little bit stuffy, and the length of his memories, and the fact that Rabbi Blumenthal told me that you girls never hadn't eaten yet, and I began to empathize a little bit. Boy, these people have a really long and hard day. Sitting and listening to one person after the other, and not even eating, not having some refreshment, not having something to fill their stomachs. And I thought to myself, that would be a good way of pointing out a little bit about the Holocaust. Take the hunger and thirst that you felt for about an hour or two, multiply it by about 100 gazillion, and you get a little bit of an inkling of Tsaram Shel Yisrael, which is the concept that we began with. No, you didn't have a Holocaust earlier today. But it gives you a little bit of a nisoyan to understand, to sit through lengthy drushes and even lengthy limudim is a nisoyan. But understand also the importance of why you're doing this. But let's go ahead. You may have heard that the Nazis in Makshimum were the latest manifestation of Amalek. I could give you a long shiur about Amalek, but we'll just point out a few things. Did you ever go out to the garden and pick up a rock which looks nice and clean and gleaming on the outside, but pick it up and see all the yich on the bottom, right? That's what Amalek is to us. Part of the same rock, we're part of the same Metzias. Wherever Klal Yisrael has gone, Amalek has come with us. They met us right outside of Mitzrayim, and later they were in the south of Eretz Yisrael in the time of Shaul, with the Melchemes Agog. And then some centuries later they met us in Paras Umadai, Haman. And according to many Gdolei Yisrael, yet again in Germany. Where are they now? Luckily we don't really know. If we knew, we'd probably have a chiyuv mid'oraisa to go and kill them. That could land us in jail. But the L'maisa, they're all around us. And the fight against Amalek is an eternal fight until HaKadosh Baruch Hu brings it to a stop. Hashem says, Mochoi emche. In one place he says, Timche, you have to fight against Amalek. But the ultimate victory will not be achieved by you, because Mochoi emche, I will achieve the victory over Amalek. And that'll be L'osid Lovo when Mashiach comes. But meanwhile, you have to keep on fighting. What is this fight against Amalek? What is it about Amalek that makes them hate us? What is it about us that makes Amalek hate us? If you look at the end of Parshas Kiseitze, Parshas Zohar, it says, Asher korcho baderech vayzanev b'chol kol hanechsholim acharecha v'yata oyef v'yogea v'loi yorei elokim. The war of Amalek is against the Rabbeinu Shalom. The definition of Amalek is that nation which does not fear God. Lo yorei elokim. We, as I mentioned earlier, are the foot soldiers of the Rabbeinu Shalom. We are in the front lines of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's war against Amalek. Ki milchama l'Hashem ba'Amalek midor dor. We are there on the front line. Mamela, we are the object of their venom and their hatred. But it's a hatred against HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You know, Hitler wrote a book when he was in prison in 1923, and the book is called Mein Kampf, which means my war. Essentially the war of Amalek, but it's my war. I had the misfortune of reading it. And numerous times in Mein Kampf he makes reference to his particular feeling of being sickened or nausea when he saw what he referred to as the Ostjude on the streets of Vienna. Ostjude in German means the Eastern Jews. The ones that had come from Vienna during World War I plagued him from the fighting, and they moved to Vienna, or what we would refer to today as perhaps as Chassidish Yidden. What Hitler Machshamoy couldn't tolerate was the appearance of people like me, basically. The Tzura of a Yid. So the Shaila is, what is he? What's his problem? He doesn't like facial hair. He doesn't like jackets that are maybe a little bit too long. What's his issue? Very simple. The issue is that he recognized that this is a representation of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, devotion to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Of course, not the only one, but it is a clear representation of devotion to Hashem. That's what sickens him, because that's what sickens Amalek. Famous picture taken in Vienna in 1938 after the Anschluss, where they annexed Austria peacefully. Picture of a procession of Jews in the streets of Vienna. Ostjude, most of them. Hasidic looking Yidden. At the end, at the beginning of the procession, was a Yid with a long white beard. Of course, was made to not have any covering on his head. And the Nazi soldiers had placed upon him, hanging from his neck, a little sign, a placard. And the placard read in German, "Our God will save us. Unser Gott wird uns retten." R-E-T-E-N in German. Our God will save us. And in the picture, you have 4 or 5 SS guards standing around laughing. Because this guy, these Yidden, were obviously being victimized and were totally lacking in control of the situation. They were being treated like dirt. Expressed the belief that their God, our HaKadosh Baruch Hu, will save them. So they were laughing and having just a jolly old time. Why did they do that? What was the purpose of the sign? Our God will save us. You don't like Jews? Kill them. Terrorize them. What is this thing about God? Teretz is Amalek. In Lublin, there was the head of the SS in Lublin, was a fellow named Globachnik. Odilo, I think. Globachnik. 2 things happened in Lublin. One, they took all of the Sforim out of the famous Yeshivas Chachmei Lublin, which probably you will see in a few months' time. And they made an enormous fire. The Yidden were forced to throw their own Gemaras and Chumoshim and Sidurim into the fire. In Yiddish you might say, "Vus failed those." What's the purpose of that? Now, they knew, because they were Amalek, they knew what was in those Sforim, and that was their war. This Globachnik had a whole group of Yidden stand outside in a courtyard, and he said, "Sing and dance." They were not in the mood of singing and dancing. But he repeated, and he started screaming loudly, "Sing and dance!" Finally, the 3rd or 4th time, because they were holding machine guns to their heads, the Yidden decided, "Okay, Loma singen." And they held hands and they started singing something like Ashreinu Matov Chalkeinu or La Hashem Ha'oretzum Loyo, something of devotion to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And you know what? They got into it. They were singing and dancing. They were following Globachnik's instructions. Until Globachnik started to feel, hey, this is turning into some religious devotion. And he said, "Stop!" They wouldn't stop. And he screamed, I'm not going to imitate because I wasn't there. I can't really imitate. He screamed at the top of his lungs, "Stop! Stop!" Many of them had to be killed in order to stop. What was it all about? He was into singing and dancing. What was his agenda? His agenda was the agenda of Amalek. My mother, Aleh Shalom, told me once that her oldest brother, who was a Chashuv Ger Chassid, came back during the war, came back into the house, and the Nazis had snipped off one of his payas. What happened? The scissors stopped working before they got to the second one. But you know, it's far more dehumanizing to cut off one paya than to cut off 2. He came back into the house crying because the tzura of a Yid became the object of their chozik, became the object of their ridicule. Why did they do that? Because the tzura of the Yid, Tzelem Alekim, is a tzura of the Rabbeinu Shalom, and that is what the agenda is. It's not only we who recognize this, by the way, it's they who recognize this too. One of the greatest criminals of the Third Reich was a fellow named Julius Streicher. Julius Streicher. He was the editor and founder of a newspaper called The Stürmer. This was the organ of propaganda of Nazism. From 1925, I believe, is when the paper opened, throughout the up until and during the war. This newspaper poisoned the minds of millions and millions of Germans with hatred for the Yid. And of course he was apprehended, arrested, and at the Nuremberg war trials in 1945, just a couple of months after the war had finished, the war trials began, he and many others were tried for their crimes against humanity, and he was found guilty, of course, and he was sentenced to hang. And the date was 1945, the day was Hoshana Rabbah. And as Streicher stood there, with the noose placed around his neck, just moments before he was going to be dropped to his well-deserved death, he looked out at those who were spectators, and he said, Purim Spiel, 1945. Of course, he had the calendar wrong. It wasn't Purim, it was Hoshana Rabbah, but we know what he means. Purim Spiel means it's yet again the replaying of the narrative of Purim. Haman lost then. Sarah's Bnei Haman were hung. He lost that bout. He lost that battle, but the war is not over. I think what he intended was a bone-chilling message. This is another Purim spiel. You can hang me, and he was, of course, hanged. But the war is not over. His Amalek will forever and ever have a sinah to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and we who represent him will be those charged with the responsibility of defending HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's why we're here. And that's why we get it over the head very often. But it still makes it worth it. Nothing can be more fulfilling in life than a person defending the honor of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That was Amalek. I'm racing against the clock, so I will again, perhaps momentarily, skip number 7. So if you can remind me, if we have time, I will go back to number 5, bones. The Atzamos HaYeveshus. Did you learn the Nevuah of the Atzamos HaYeveshus in Yecheskel? Kodesh Baruch Hu said, can these bones come back to life? So Yecheskel was a little bit, he was perturbed. He was going to answer yes, no. I mean, how could they come to life? But on the other hand, no. But Kodesh Baruch Hu, the bones became covered again with krum, with flesh, sinews, etc., and the bones came back to life. The Nevuah of Yecheskel HaNavi. I mentioned earlier the Belzer Rebbe. Let me tell you a vort from the Belzer Rebbe which is so telling of this concept of the rebuilding and the coming back to life of the dry bones. The Belzer Rebbe lost, as I mentioned to you, 11 children. He barely escaped with his own life. Suffered terribly. In Galicia, in a ghetto called the Bochnia ghetto. Finally made his way to Budapest and ultimately to Eretz Yisrael. Not only did he lose his personal 11 children, but he lost tens of thousands of Belzer Hasidim. He was a broken person. But life has to go on. I think the year was 1947 or 8. The Belzer Rebbe once again began to be the manhig of the Eidah of Belz. And the first tish that he feared, to fear tish means to conduct a tish, a Chassidish tish, happened to be Parshas B'Shalach. When I tell you Parshas B'Shalach, you're thinking Oz Yosher, Shira Sayom. The following is what he said about the Shira Sayom. By the way, I noticed that some of you, I don't mean anything, but if you're looking, I'm doing what Rabbi Blumenthal asked me to do, and it's continue until 3:45. So if in case, if anyone feels that they really can't anymore, I'm not offended. At any rate, the Belzer Rebbe said the following about Parshas B'Shalach. Shira Sayom. Yidden are singing and dancing, O Shira Lashem Ki Go, Go. They're just happy, and they're wild in their ecstasy. Do you remember when Kriyas Yamsuf took place? The date was Chof Aleph Nisan. It was only a few weeks before, when they were still in Mitzrayim, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu afflicted Mitzrayim with the 9th of the 10 Makas. It's the Makas Choshech. And you probably remember learning that in Makas Choshech the vast majority of Klal Yisrael perished. Those who questioned, those who did not want to go on this dream that Moshe was telling them about coming to Eretz Yisrael, receiving a Torah, coming to Eretz Yisrael, and having a Beis Hamikdash. Roiv of Klal Yisrael perished in Makas Choshech. The Pasuk says, "V'chamushim olu b'nei Yisrael miMitzrayim," and the Medrash says, "Echad michamisha" or "Echad michamishim." Only 1 out of 5, or maybe only 1 out of 50 left Mitzrayim. What happened to the rest? And they stayed there. They perished, no longer part of Klal Yisrael. But that means that the Yidden who stood at Kriyas Yamsuf, All of them were grief-stricken. It was only a few weeks prior to that they lost their children or their siblings, their parents, their extended families. But what makes a Yid is the fact that despite that grief, he's able to stand after Kriyas Yamsuf, connect with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, recognize what HaKadosh Baruch Hu has done, and sing Ashiro L'Hashem Ki Go'ei Go' Sus V'roichloi Rama Bayom. He said that about himself, and he said it about the broken shards, the human remains that were sitting in front of him, those the She'eris HaPleita who had lost everything too, but they were there to start all over again. And he said, Miz Nochamu Unfangu. We have to start again. And so they did. And so did the yeshivas and other Hasidus. HaKadosh Baruch Hu asked Yecheskel Hanovi, can the dry bones come back to life? The answer, of course, is yes. I'll tell you two other stories with the same Musar Haskell. And they both involved me to some extent personally. One was a Yid, about a Yid who lived here in Toronto, was nifter maybe 2 years ago. His name was Pinchas Feinstadt. I don't know if anyone remembers Pinchas Feinstadt. Big Talmud Chacham, a Ger Chassid, big Talmud Chacham. He never talked about the war, but he had a few of us who were his sort of Talmidim, those of us who tried to get from him some zichroinos, some thoughts from the Milchamos. One Simchas Torah. Kitoiv Leila Melech Bayoyin, we were imbibing a little bit in L'chaims at the Kiddush. So it starts opening up. Nichnas Yayin Yoitze Soy. He started sharing some of the zichroinos. He told me that on the day that he was liberated from Dachau, he and a few other people, they didn't have, thank you very much, they didn't have anything to eat or to drink. The first thing they asked for, maybe not the very first thing, but within a day they were asking, please bring us a Gemara. Klal Yisrael has in its essence, in its collective essence, the ability to bring themselves back to life. We shine in the darkness. The Medrash says, Parsha Shmois, Be'ele Shmois B'nai Yisrael, the names. So the Medrash analogizes and says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu loves the stars and he loves the Yidden. Moine Misbar L'Koichovim L'Chulam Shemos Yikra. We are like stars, says one of the Meforshim. Yes, we're like stars. Stars are hardly visible if it's light outside. Even at night, with the city lights, it's hard to see the stars. You go to the country on a cloudless night, the stars are bright. They illuminate the entire horizon. Klal Yisrael are those lights in the dark sky, and the darker the sky, the brighter we become. So can those dry bones come back to life? Of course they can. That's a limud. You have to take off from a Holocaust study the ability that the Yid has to reclaim his life. I don't know if you've ever seen the traditional complete dress code of Ger Hasidim, but they wear the pants and tucked into the socks. Hoizen Zaken, we call it. Right? My oldest son-in-law's grandfather was Oleg Zintzan. Ger Chassid always learned Berach 6 hours a day. Big Talmud Chacham. He was in Auschwitz. And I don't know if he was liberated there, but he was in Auschwitz and he was in other camps. The day that he was liberated, you know the first thing that he did? He stuck his pants into his socks. I mentioned this to you? Yes. Dry bones coming back to life? You bet. And plainer, simpler people, ehrliche people. Again, I'll cite from my parents who were able to come back having lost everything, but to rededicate themselves to Masoyros Avos. Dry bones coming back to life. The 9th, and it looks like time-wise it might be the last. So unfortunately, I don't know if I'm going to get to number 5 and number 7. Maybe some other time. Perhaps the most important lesson, that's the lesson of the eternity of Klal Yisrael. Not the ability for the dry bones, that's one thing, but the eternity of Klal Yisrael. HaKadosh Baruch Hu told us the following words, V'af gam zois, b'hiyoisem be'eretz oiveihem. Despite everything, you should know that b'hiyoisem be'eretz oiveihem, and Klal Yisrael will be stuck there in the lands of their enemies. Loi me'astim v'loi ga'altim l'chaloisom. I will never come to the point of scorning and hating them, to the point of destroying them. L'hofer brisi itam, and to abolish the covenant that I have with them. Ki ani Hashem Elokehem. HaKadosh Baruch Hu promised us that we will be an eternal people. And don't you know it? We are. Think back to the ancient world. I know you weren't there, but you learn. Raise your hands if you can tell me the last time you met a Yavusi. Anyone? How about a Girgoshi? Knani? No one? That's right. Where are they? Yeah. Oh, you met one?
No, but we don't know who they are. They might be
That's right. That's right. But they don't know who they are either. And that means they don't exist. A person with no identity doesn't exist.
But they are out there, so
No, they're not.
they're just people.
Not as a nation, not as anyone, even with an individual identity. Right?
They're just people.
The nations don't exist. Biologically, those people lived in Canaan who had children, and those children moved somewhere else, and they had children, they had children, they had children, they had children. Yeah, somehow the descendants exist, but there's no such thing anymore. The peoples don't exist. Right? Yes, there's another ancient people that exists, and that's the Chinese. But they've never left. It's not a great chachma to be able to stay in their own land without being exiled, or maybe I should say exiled, and never having to be challenged with extinction. But show me another people that was expelled and marching around in this thousands years odyssey from place to place, and continuing not only to survive by the skin of our teeth, but again, look at us. Just walk around Lawrence and Bathurst, from Wilson all the way down to Viewmount on a Shabbos morning. Klal Yisrael exists. Ki ani Hashem Elokehem. And I'm going to share with you another Amaisa. But it's not to tell you stories l'shem stories, but a story l'shem internalizing this concept. You may have heard this story. One of the more recent ones that I've added to the list of Maisim that I share, it has to do with Hanukkah. That's why I think it's so timely. I mentioned earlier that my sister was born in Bergen-Belsen. Bergen-Belsen became a displaced persons camp, a DP camp after the war. Before the war, it was a German military base, and during the war, it was one of the worst concentration camps in the network of the Nazi concentration camps. The Blujever Rebbe, Zecher Tzadik V'Kodesh L'Vroch, was in Bergen-Belsen. And it must have been 1943, before Hanukkah. The people in his barrack who knew, I mean, he didn't look like a Rebbe at that time. Everyone had the same, concentration camp issue of uniform. Looked no more like a Rebbe than you do. But they knew he was the Rebbe. He was a Choshev Yid. They came to him and said, Rebbe, what are we going to do? We're coming up to Hanukkah, a couple of weeks. How can we celebrate Hanukkah? Now, when we think of celebrating Hanukkah, we think of latkes, right? And jelly donuts, and parties, and Hanukkah gelt, especially Hanukkah gelt, right? That's what we think of when we think of Hanukkah. Celebrations, family parties, and Adarabah, we should have and enjoy all of these things. Easy on the latkes. But that's not what they were talking about when they said, how do we celebrate Chanukah, they weren't talking about latkes. They were talking about being Mekayim, the simple mitzvah of Hadlokas Ner Chanukah. What are we going to do about Chanukah in the concentration camp? Where can we tzin Chanukah lech? The Rebbe didn't have an answer, but one Yid said, you know what, Rebbe? The shoes that we have here, they were issued wooden shoes, which have a concave part of it where the ball of the foot goes in. There's a bowl in the shoes. We can use that as a Chanukah lamp, as a Chanukiah. Wicks, well, surely everyone can take out a few threads of their silly old uniform and we can braid them together and we have wicks. So I said, what do we do for oil? So one of the people in the barracks said, you know, I have a special job. Every morning it's my job to polish the boots of the capo. You know what a capo was usually a Russia who lorded over everybody in the barracks. I have to polish the capo's boots every morning. And you know what I use to polish the capo's boots? Shoe polish. You know what the shoe polish is based on? Some sort of oil. We have an oven here. We'll just melt some of the shoe polish and we'll use that for oil. So we have a Chanukah lamp, we have wicks, and we have oil. We're all set. The kach hava. And so it was. In the middle of that darkness, in the middle of that terror, in the middle of that starvation, in the middle of everything that a concentration camp was, on the first night of Hanukkah, the Rebbe, who was asked to do the mitzvah, to be moitzi everybody, was standing there, and he was about to light Hanukkah candles. The first night of Hanukkah, so we started saying the first bracha. Asher Kiddush Shonu B'Mitzvosav. We probably said Kiddushuni B'Mitzvosav. V'tzivonu lahadlik ner Chanukah. B'chasidim say ner, not ner shell. Lahadlik ner Chanukah. He said the first bracha. Then he said the second bracha. Shos anisim l'avasayim v'yom haim bazman hazeh. As he was about to say the third bracha, he stopped. He didn't go weiter. And he was standing there. I don't know what sort of shamash he had, but he was standing there and he was looking around him. And he hesitated for a long time. And finally he said the Shechionu, and he lit the candles. And they sang Mois Tzur. That's not the whole Maisa though. Because after all of this, one Yid, who was not a Fruma Yid, but a respectful person, came to the Blues of Rebbe and asked him, Rebbe, you said the bracha Asher Kiddushon Mitzvosav Verstayich. I understand. The mitzvah, you did the mitzvah. You said Shos Anisim L'Avasenu V'Yom Haim Zman Hazeh. I understand. Hashem did a miracle with that. But the Rebbe, how could you possibly have said the bracha She'echeyonu V'Kiyemonu V'Higiyonu L'Zman Hazeh? Rebbe, look at where we are. Look at what our lives are like. Look at the fact that most of us will not survive. This is what we're thanking the Rebbeinu Shalom for. So he said to this Yid, you know, I had the same difficulty as you have. I didn't know how I could say the bracha. But then I looked around in the barracks and I saw Yidden, from a Yidden, not from a Yidden. They're all standing there looking at me, waiting for me to continue. So I said, your people in this matzav only want one thing, to do your mitzvah. That's what I made the Shechianu. The Yid became from, after the Mulchama, he met the Blues of Rebbe, the Chassan, and he said, Rebbe, your answer to me saved me during the Mulchama, and it got me thinking after the Mulchama. The Nitzchus of Klal Yisrael is based on the fact that we continue to do what we're supposed to do. We were given into this world with a purpose, with a tachlis. We go about our business with only that goal in mind. That is what is the formation of our nitzchias. Those who perished in Mitzrayim perished because they went off to the left or to the right. I'm not making any political statements. They went off from the derech, the kav, the shvil, the shvil hazov. What keeps Klal Yisrael nitzchi is that we stick to the shvil hazov. And despite the fact that maybe some of us have even been divested of our frumkeit, like those Yidden in the barracks, and many of them. But still, the Yiddish Kishke remains a Yiddish Kishke. The essence of the Jew remains Nitzchi. Klal Yisrael promised us. And that is the basis of our Kiyum. Very important limud. You see, when you look at the Holocaust and you read much more than the details and the statistics and the stories, but you understand that they're all connected to a Musar Haskel, they're all connected to a limud, they're all connected to a hashkofa, they're all connecting to a Kodesh Baruch Hu, then you understand that Holocaust education becomes elevated from another subject to something which can have it has the potential to form the very substance of your Jewishness, of your Yiddishkeit. Es ist nicht stam gelernt. It's not just something to learn. It's something to live. It's something that gives you the emunah that you can connect to in a very real way. So, my time is up. We didn't do 2 out of the 9 limudim. Not so bad. We did 7 out of the 9. Let's think the optimistic view. We did 7 out of the 9. And I'll conclude with a wish that the Rebbeinu Shalom should spare us from having to talk about Holocaust education in the future, but that can only come to be as Goyal in here. Amen.